And that is very biblical, and that is very close to a common view found in all three of these writers, even if you had to go into them and become esoteric in order to find it.
Well, I know that for a lot of people today, and I guess maybe since the time of the Enlightenment, that we basically created a God that got further and further away, maybe more supernatural, more way out there, as opposed to what I'm hearing you say, that Revelation is about more incarnational and more God with us.
Yes, I can certainly appreciate what you're saying. Yeah. Well, what else did we discover? That did not solve all the problems, of course. Suppose that in looking at finding these solutions, each one of those great writers had half of the story. Well, which half did they have? Suppose, in addition, not only did they have half of the story, but as they became more and more attuned to spiritual life, so also they were more and more susceptible to negative influences. And there are always people who would like to say that that's certainly a possibility. Suppose that in addition, they said that there was, suppose the other problem is that it's all, the problems are due to my misunderstanding. Who said I got it right in all of these? Because we're now at least 3 different levels of information. Well, yeah, all of those are possible, and all of those are easily admitted, and all of those keep us from claiming too much about our own interpretation. So ultimately, the next problem is how to present this information. And that boils down to something like this. We have, after all, 3 writers who wrote at great length and in much detail about the book of Revelation, a mystery vision on which very few people can agree. So how am I supposed to find some consensus in the midst of all of that? Well, with great difficulty, I think, is the answer. And in any case, what we were able to discover while we're going through this process is yet a 4th personality, a 4th so-called modern prophet, someone who in fact echoes the 3 we have been talking about. And that 4th personality is Carla Rueckert, R-U-E-C-K-E-R-T. Carla Rueckert is a channeler. She claims to be in touch with I've got to say this clearly before my audience gasps and turns us off. She seems to be in touch with a discarnate being by the name of Ra. And the material she channels from him is referred to them as the Ra material, R-A material. What is going on there is that Ra is saying to us that there is that they are presenting the ideas and the material which was known to ancient civilizations, and in those days it was called the Law of One. So this material has really a new theology that he is presenting. And yet, this so-called new theology echoes clearly the other 3, and I think I can demonstrate. In other words, somewhere along the line, there is this connection profoundly in the way these people are viewing the spiritual world. In order to present this, she, I hear someone say, well, then concentrating just on her, even though it echoes things, is that fair? Well, it may not be. I say, it probably is not going to work. On the other hand, I think it did work. But I'll have to leave that up to the presenters, to those who are listening to us this morning or afternoon or whatever hour it is. What then are the similarities between these so-called, these four now personalities? Well, one really, and remember, these are all separated by 50 or 100 or 200 years. They have no reason to have known each other or to read about them, except possibly Ruckert, maybe she, because she is already, she's still living and could have read any one of these three people. On the other hand, there is no reason at all to believe that she ever did. What are the common characteristics? Well, all four of them now believe in the one God. They sometimes use different words, but for example, Ruckert used the word prime creator. There are others who use the word the source, others who say the prime mover, and so forth and so on. So it could be that they use a different kind of an idea, but it is always the idea of the one eternal, all-knowing, all-sufficient God, and that is an idea that ought to resonate with at least the Christian tradition and perhaps with many others. Mm-hmm. Well, what is the second thing on which all four of them seem to agree? They seem to agree that there is an evolutionary process. Okay, man is changing, and as he changes, he grows spiritually back to God. Now, is that also an echo of what we already accept? Yeah, it probably is. Now, there is a disagreement perhaps on exactly how that is done. And for example, Swedenborg says, well, yeah, we're growing back, but it will be done in terms of the new church. There will be a new understanding of our spiritual, and the old church, this is also important to understand, will pass away. Just like the old world will pass away, and a new one will arrive in its stead. And maybe there are some people who would think that's not that far away. Well, what about that new church? What can we say? What can you say it is? There is this possible understanding that the church, after all, simply represents a meeting place. And that meeting place is a meeting of the body, soul, and spirit. And so it is that as those body, soul, and spirit interact and affect each other, so the body changes its characteristic, the soul, the seat of memory, basically, and the spirit also are changing and moving on into the future in which there is finally a new heaven and a new earth. So while there's an evolutionary process, it doesn't look at all like Darwinian evolution. Is there anything like that in the other two? Well, the other two, for example, it's Rudolf Steiner. Steiner says, yes, it's an evolution, and the evolution that he describes is a change in growth and development between matter and humanity and spirituality. So there is also a change, and it's described as it is also described in the book of Revelation, but he has different solutions, different words, different vocabulary, which I can promise you is very difficult to learn. It took me maybe 20 years just to learn his vocabulary, and I began to wonder if it was worthwhile. Well, I think maybe it was.
Now you're talking about Steiner here.
Steiner. The other one was Casey. Casey said, yeah, there is a change in evolution. There is this process that humanity is going through. But he concentrated on the process internally in the human body. And that is a process in which there are 7 endocrine glands. They represent chakras, which is a kind of a different way of understanding the endocrine system, but understanding it spiritually from that point of view. And yet he too concentrates eventually on man's changes now and in the future. Ruckert, finally, fourth, is more like Casey. The structure of what she is saying is more like his, with a much heavier emphasis on the spiritual development. And she concentrates a lot, for example, on the heart of man and his compassion and love, and how that will be changing mankind, the self, in the future. Okay? So, there is a fourth character, there is at least a third characteristic. Remember, we talked about one God, an evolutionary process, and thirdly, the same ethical imperative. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that in the end, this is a story about how love changes us. Each of them have a different way of presenting that. Swedenborg talks a lot about the light and love and wisdom, and how these are changing us internally. And there is similar kind of understanding and logic in both Casey and Steiner, but it is particularly obvious in Ruckert's. Well, as we were saying, there is also an ethical imperative that is common to all of these writers that we're talking about. The ethical imperative is to love your God and your neighbor. Now, if you don't, but in doing that, the self needs to make a choice. It doesn't happen automatically. As you well know, there's nothing whispering in your ear that says, do this, don't do that, be sure you clean your nose in the morning, be sure you don't step in the wrong direction. We don't get that kind of direction when we land on this earth. We have forgotten everything we ever knew about our existence in the previous life or in God's heaven. We don't know those things. We arrive here completely, apparently, dumbfounded, and but we are stuck with the problem of deciding and choosing what we will do. And what are the choices? The choice is that the self may grow outward toward love of God and man, or it may grow inward toward selfishness and the bad things that happen when you're a selfish person. Now, you know you have those choices to make, and you don't get out of making them. This makes it very difficult to live on this earth. All of these writers say, basically, this is not the only earth that there is. There are a lot of other earths, planets, universes out there, and this happens to be ours.